Welcome to the Podcasting Essentials Summer Series, the best episodes of 2021. We were lucky enough to speak to Ian Walker, one of Australia's leading podcast executive producers, about how the ABC produces its high-end narrative podcasts. And it's an episode packed with lessons for brands. Just a note that since recording this episode, and after 7 years at the ABC, Ian is now Senior Executive Producer, Factual and Scripted Podcasts at Listnr. Sound Cartel.
In this episode, we talk to a master of Australian podcast production, Ian Walker, Executive Producer at ABC Audio Studios. Ian's responsible for some of Australia's most successful narrative podcasts, and he explains what goes into producing award-winning shows that attract such huge audiences.
There's an old adage where no one ever won an Academy Award for staying inside a budget, right? And there's some horrendous Hollywood stories of blowing budgets to smithereens, but somewhere in the middle there's a sweet spot about understanding that you have to spend money to make money, and also to make that real connection with the audience, which is where you want to be if you've got a brand and you want to make yourself known in that word-of-mouth way, where people are happy to spread the word for you.
I'm Nick Schildberger, Managing Director of audio agency Sound Cartel, and this is Podcasting Essentials. Welcome to episode 13 of season 5. And joining me is producer and co-host Nicole Goodman.
G'day, Nick. Lovely to be with you again.
Now, it is no secret that we are both huge fans of narrative podcasts produced by the ABC. And we're so privileged to chat to the man behind many of their biggest hits.
That's right, and the ABC really has set a very high bar in recent years. Many of their podcasts sit comfortably with those coming out of Gimlet and Wondery and Apple. But there are also lessons for brands in how our national broadcaster approaches podcasting.
Yes, that's right. Whether it be the style, formats, or how they promote their podcasts, this is a great opportunity to learn from their investment.
That's right.
The ABC has done the hard yards, and for that, I'm very grateful. So let's get to undoubtedly one of Australia's experts in the industry, Ian Walker.
Well, Ian is an experienced and award-winning TV and radio documentary maker, a strong pedigree that he took with him when he moved to work on podcasting at the ABC. Ian is now the executive producer of narrative non-fiction at ABC Audio Studios. And he's overseen the launch of more than a dozen new podcasts, including the hit kids show Short and Curly and the award-winning true crime series Unravel.
Love it.
Few know more about what it takes to produce the very best narrative podcasts. So we are delighted to have the opportunity to talk to Ian.
Welcome, Ian, to Podcasting Essentials.
Hey, Ian. Welcome. Thank you so much for being with us. Now, you have some renovations going on at the moment, I hear?
Oh, yes. Sorry about the noise. But by the end of it, I'm hoping that there's my very own little podcast studio in the backyard. So hopefully it'll be worth it.
All worth it. Absolutely.
Now, Ian, I love that your LinkedIn headline simply states, making Australia's best podcasts. And it really is hard to disagree with so many fabulous shows being produced by the ABC. Would it be correct to assume that you love your job? And what is it about producing narrative non-fiction podcasts that excites you?
I do love my job. I think I'm a pretty lucky guy in that I've managed to land in a place that's sort of growing at the time. I'm making documentaries, which is where I started my storytelling career. I get resourced and I get to play with investigative teams and very fine people who make me look good. So that is a really great job to have, and there's not many of them in Australia, as we know. So yeah, I am kind of blessed. It took me a while to sort of wrangle it all. I think the reason why I've stuck with non-fiction is that we get to make the stories that completely surprise people. You know, the stuff that when they say you can't write this shit, that actually is true. Fiction writers can't compete with us for the best stories that we have. The stories that really have that ability to surprise you, to uplift you, to make you learn about the human condition, that are true. And so you can't beat stories like that. And I do love that that's the patch that I play in.
Ian, you've had great success with podcasts, from kid shows like Short and Curly to the award-winning true crime series Unravel, and more on that a bit later. The story itself is so critical in the success of a podcast. So where do the stories come from? And how do you know what story is going to be a hit?
It's a good question. I guess the stories can come from anywhere, right? I get pitched a lot of stories every week. People are sending me new ideas that they want to turn into a story. Sometimes they come from colleagues, sometimes from random things on the internet, sometimes from my very substantial bottom drawer of a kind of lifetime of being a documentary maker. I've got a substantial cachet of things that I haven't quite turned into stories yet. But I think the important thing that I look for always is a kind of checklist of things that a story must have to make a series, to make a narrative non-fiction series work. A protagonist, you need oodles of plot if you're going to make the story move forward. You need those sort of twists and turns. You need to be looking at a kind of fresh take, even if it's a story that's well known. But what we need to say yes to a story like that is a brand new take or a brand new information about it. I mean, another place that I really like to look at for stories is a way to flip a genre. I think we did that with Unravel Season 4 with Snowball, in that we made that a very personal tale. We almost made it a comedy in parts. And that was pretty fresh for a true crime story, without a dead body. And it was a female protagonist who was a really kind of bad guy, so and an intriguing person. So they're the kinds of things. Access is the other great thing that I always need to tick. That's about 95% of a documentary maker's work, is access to something that someone else can't get. I mean, at the ABC, we also try for a few more highfalutin reasons to choose a story, and they're kind of higher purpose things related to our charter. And with true crime, it's really important for us not to just be tabloid and not to just play around in the muck of people's lives and the dark stuff. We want to usually have a higher purpose about reflecting something about society. We did Barrenjoey Road, which was a real examination of how women were treated in the 70s, and it was really illuminating for people who weren't around then about how bad things were back in that day. We chose Blood on the Tracks, Season 1, because we wanted to look at the justice system for Aboriginal people and how that goes. Our next little obsession is about stories that might have some change in real life. That's the other purpose that we choose a true crime story. There might be a miscarriage of justice to have a look at, and that's another reason why the ABC might do this story rather than anyone else.
Well, Ian, in your role now at ABC Studios, you're executive producer, narrative non-fiction. Can you explain what the role of an EP actually is in creating a narrative podcast series? And also, what did you study or do to find yourself in this incredible role at the ABC?
Yeah, well, executive producer of podcast is a pretty ill-defined term in most places. Most people don't have a clue really what I do day to day, because I guess it involves just a multiplicity of things. Everything from finding the next series, assessing ideas, talent spotting, finding new talent for hosting jobs or new reporters who might bring something to a story that we've already sourced. Team building is a massive part of what I do, and I collect people along the way, sometimes who I've been talking to for years and years, who finally I get to bring them on board in a team. So a lot of it's sort of being aware of what all the things that go together in making a great team and a great show. My main job, I think, is to get out of the way of those people that I've put together and chosen to do their jobs, and to unblock anything that's preventing them from doing the best they can, and then to be the freshest ears possible when they need me. So I try and stay arm's length from the story as they're doing it. I don't want to be in the weeds of every single little thing that they find, because I want to be their very first audience person, to respond to what they've come up with and let them know what's not working, what is working. It's almost like a lifetime of documentary making myself. I've made dozens of background briefings and other features for Radio National in audio, and as well as that I made dozens of television shows and feature documentaries myself for TV. So And I also spent some time in an digital online platform for the ABC called ABC Open. So I guess this job particularly brings together all of that experience and all of that skill set. I'm also like an editor of scripts and a writer, so I get very involved in that. I've also been a muso and I've made music, and I love spending time in the studio. So I'm always the last person to be hearing the mix with the engineer and signing off on a mix. So the overall sound of the show, every little bit of that combination of music and sound effects, I will have some input into. There's a lot of people involved. It's very much a team effort. I guess quality control officer is one of the main jobs, and that's where I need to be able to sign off on every part of that process.
It's great to hear all that, because I think there are some people who don't appreciate how many moving parts there are that go into producing a narrative podcast. And we've spoken a lot about it recently on this podcast. We're trying to encourage brands to aspire to produce more narrative-style podcasts so that they can really stand out from the crowd. But we also know that they're more resource-hungry, as you well know, than perhaps an interview show. What is the size of the team that works on an ABC narrative podcast series?
Well, I guess because most of the shows that I've been working on have been investigations, that they're trying to find new things, then we always have a journalist in the lead, at least one. I guess it's hard to nail down all of the jobs in our teams, but it's between 5 and 10. Now, there's key roles, which is usually host. We have a supervising producer. We have a senior producer, generally a junior producer who's also the fact checker and the researcher. So we double up some roles. And then we have an executive producer on the top of that. So that's sort of 5 main roles. But there are other key people, obviously, who come into play. A sound engineer, a sound designer, who we get for at least 2 weeks per episode on a big show. That's generally hardly ever enough, but it is a luxury item, right? It's a big resource there. We spend a lot of time on the sound of the show.
Well, luxury, but a necessity as well.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, we're competing in a very competitive space, right? We're up against all of the best shows that come out of places like Gimlet and the US. And so we need to be world class to be able to compete for ears. So I think it's justifiable expense and resource. But I think there is a way for people who play in the branded podcast world to think about how to use narrative. You may not be able to afford the same kind of big teams that we do, but there are really canny producer, reporters and sound designers out there who are kind of like one-stop shops. And in the same way that television documentaries became that kind of shooter, director, editor person, there are people in audio starting to be able to do that work. And if you give them enough time, they can bring you a product that's not dissimilar to how one of our shows might sound.
Ian, the Unravel True Crime podcast is now in its 5th season with Juanita, and it's one of the ABC's and your most successful franchise podcasts. We've discussed Snowball, which was season 4, on this podcast before, and it won Best True Crime Podcast at the Australian Podcast Awards in 2020. And it even managed a full takeover of the Apple Podcast featured section, which we were in awe about. We love that. So first, a belated congratulations on all of that. It's a truly brilliant series. We loved it. But I wanted to dig a little deeper into what goes into producing such a successful podcast. And I'd like to start with how long it takes from idea to launch.
So these big series, usually 6 to 8 episodes, are generally taking like 6 months from go to woe. There's usually a period before that of development, or the stories that we've been choosing a lot of the time have already been worked up to a state where they can start work on the reporting straight away. So that's discounting a development period. So sometimes those have been developed over a very long period of time, or months at least. You know, we've found a big audience for the show. I can tell you that the whole of the Unravel 5 seasons have just hit over 11 million downloads. So that's pretty extraordinary for the ABC, and it means that per episode, those shows are the biggest podcast for the ABC. So it's great for me and for the teams that we work with to be doing that. And we've now got a commitment from the ABC that we're going to keep doing Unravel because the audience is there for it. For the current season, the Juanita Nielsen series we hit the same level as we did for Snowball in half the time. So Snowball was an incredible success, and we batch published that. We had a lot of people who were completely hooked and telling us that they were binging the whole series in 2 days and stuff like that, which I'm not sure I would recommend. People need to have a life, but it's very nice to hear that. You put a lot of sweat, blood and tears into a show. But Juanita has got to the same numbers in half the time. So it's on track to be bigger again than Snowball. And that's really gratifying for me because it means the audience is still there. It's also a bit of a tick for the anthology series idea, that we've built this anthology because we're building an audience who love this genre. They want to be challenged, but they want something different every time. So we've got to keep them interested and keep them happy and keep them coming back and telling other people about the show. And I think that's what's working.
It really is a bit of a snowball effect.
That's what he did there.
Now, that's great to hear that there'll be more series in the Unravel genre. I particularly like Snowball, but it was such a personal story. And I guess I'm interested in what's involved in taking such a personal story and turning it into a podcast. And similarly, how much of the story and the episodes are planned before you start recording?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Ollie Wards is a colleague of ours. He was the boss of Triple J at the time when I bumped into him in the cafeteria one day, and he said, I might have this story for you. It happened to our family. And he started to tell me the bare bones of what that was and about his crazy sister-in-law and what happened to his dear brother. And, he said, I think, there might be a podcast in it, but I can't tell because who cares about my family? And it was like, well, Ollie, that's a pretty wild story. I don't know that happens to most people. And, I also know something about you. And I know that, you haven't made programs for a while because you've been the boss there, but he's an excellent story maker. And I'd heard a lot of his work in the past and we'd known each other for quite a few years. And I said, Ollie, I think you need to write this down for me, just one page, come back and let's have a talk about it. And I think from that very first day, I knew that all I had to do was kind of convince him to sign up. And yeah, it was something fresh for us. I think there was a bit of pushback at the time on those familiar story tropes that true crime was doing, like especially dead women, and a real distaste for doing that same story over and over. The protagonist in it was a con woman who you hardly ever hear about because they're just a rarer breed. But also that idea of Ollie doing this on behalf of his family and making it a very personal story, that was just gold to me because the investment is so high, right? So again, it came back to ticking that matrix of things that make a good story, and you really want a good storyteller in the lead role, but investment and stakes are another thing, and there were really high stakes there. And we didn't really know what the ending would be, so we did start to map out the story once I had the bones of what had happened so far. We started to plot out the story, and I do this with every series. We usually have at least a day or two on a whiteboard where we just map out the entire universe of the story known so far and what you imagine where the story needs to go or wants to go, and then divvy that up into sort of episodes that make sense, where there's a progression or a chronology to follow. And that's essentially where we start. There's usually many changes and surprises along the way that we didn't map out. But if you have a skeleton like that, it's a much better starting point for purposeful investigation and the ideas around the kinds of things we need to collect to make this story work. So it's good to use the tools of fiction for this kind of work. You kind of try and map out a narrative arc where you think it might go and even guess the 3 different endings that you might get. And we might not have got anywhere with Leslie, right? We didn't know that she would say anything to us or say anything to Ollie or, spoiler alert for people who haven't listened to the podcast. But, we never knew that he would get to that car park and get her on tape, but he was determined as hell to do it. So, yes, we write the show before we make it, and then we rewrite it every time in the edit. You throw that out and you start again with the tape that you've got.
Now, you released Snowball all at once, as you mentioned, for those that wanted to binge it. But other ABC podcasts like The 11th and also the most recent season of Unravel, you release weekly. So what's the strategy behind this? And is there a benefit, do you think, between one method over the other?
The strategy there was actually led by our lawyers. There was a defamation risk. And so to minimise that, we decided that we would batch publish so that if there was some backlash or if there was an injunction, say, the show's already out there, like people can hear the whole of the story, they can also not judge us on being unfair to her, because you can go through to the end and show that we've been very particular and careful about being fair to her along the way. But if you heard episode 1 and then had to wait a week for episode 2, you might think we were being, unkind, or, you might miss the nuances that happen later in the series. But then there are positive reasons to go out in that way for the audience, I guess, because it's the kind of Netflix effect. People don't like waiting anymore, even though the habit for true crime and anthology series is generally a weekly output, and people understand that, and they've got busy lives. They can't listen to everything all at once. But I guess having it bingeable is a great option, because people don't have to wait, or they don't get lost in the story having to recap themselves, or, if you listen to multiple things across a week like I do, sometimes I'm sort of losing the thread of what last week's episode was about. But with this, you have the option to go through. I know a lot of people who wait to the end of a big series before they start listening, because they get so frustrated with the wait.
I must admit, that's what I do. I prefer to wait to the end then, so I can binge it in my own time.
Yeah, I'm for that too.
From a brand point of view, we recommend the weekly release because of the other benefits of marketing and that continual contact with your audience and those sorts of things. So,
yeah, the pros of the weekly output are exactly that you get to hone in on your marketing per episode. It can be targeted. You can stagger it. The resources is easier to roll out. Funnily enough, when we did the batch release, we were still treating the marketing as if we were doing a weekly release instead of chucking everything at it on day one. The word of mouth is what you want to be building up. And think about the long tail, because if you put an investment in a really good show, people will find it eventually. They will talk about it. And it's not over as soon as your season's over, We've just finished season 5, Juanita. Usually the audience spikes for those are generally like 2 or 3 weeks after the final episode. So I think that's about that critical mass of people finding the show and then telling other people in their lives about it.
So then for a narrative series like Snowball or Juanita, do you think there's a sweet spot for the number of episodes required to tell the story? And how long do you think each episode should be?
It's a good question. I mean, we go round and round on this like quite a lot in our teams. I reckon the sweet spot used to be for us thinking about people's commute, right? Which was like 20 minutes to half an hour. And no one's commuting anymore. So that's kind of been turned on its head a bit. So I think there's actually an opportunity for longer episodes, funnily enough, now, because people have actually, we've found, have more time to listen when they clock off for the day. They start cooking. There's a couple of hours of not commuting. But, for these complicated stories, I don't think you want to overburden people. Like 50 minutes is getting to the upper limit of what I think's a really good duration for these kind of shows. So I guess 30 to 40 minutes is the sweet spot that we think about. 6 to 8 episodes seems to have been where we've landed for what we think's the engine for a decent series. I think if you've got less than 6 stories, you might do a series in 4, but if you've got less than 4, you don't really have a series, right? You don't really have a season of an anthology. You've got a mini series, I guess. So yeah, look, 6 to 8, we find longer than 8 is usually unnecessary, even if you've got a big story. And I'm not a fan of podcasts that just keep on going, we won't name names, but podcasts that go on to their 16th episode and are an hour and a half long, they're just not the ones that I'm interested in, because I find that what's really wrong about them, not the duration, is actually the care given to structuring them and editing them and making the narrative go forward rather than spin the wheels or just pig out on detail that's very repetitive. I think that's the failing of some of those, shows that go on from upward of 16 episodes in a true crime.
Well, brands investing in podcasting are often budget conscious. And of course, narrative style podcasting is a lot more expensive. For Snowball, you had a crew go to the US. Can you share the benefits and results, any ROI that the ABC received from making this kind of podcast?
Look, at the end of the day, it's about audience investment, right? For these shows, you have an incredibly connected audience. They're uber invested because the shows are complicated. You have to actually sit down and listen to them. It's not like a banter show where you can have it on in the background while you do something else and phase in and phase out. You really have to be across the detail and with the story. So I guess it's an intimate experience is the other key factor, that you're getting people, you're right inside their heads. The way that we listen is very particular to podcasting. It does create a particular kind of customer. And so I think you have to honour all of those things. There's some things that you just really can't skimp on. And I guess it's sort of time necessary to make a story work is the basic equation. And sometimes that can blow out and can be a bit scary, but the consequences of sort of not giving yourself enough time is really that the story just won't sing. So there's an old adage where no one ever won an Academy Award for staying inside a budget, right? And there's some horrendous Hollywood stories of blowing budgets to smithereens, but somewhere in the middle there's a sweet spot about understanding that you have to spend money to make money, and also to make that real connection with the audience, which is where you want to be if you've got a brand and you want to make yourself known in that word of mouth way, where people are happy to spread the word for you.
So it wasn't a tough pitch to the ABC top brass when you were pitching the US trip?
Well, that was interesting because Ollie was going to do this project anyway. And there was a bit of a catch technically in that we paid him a fee, an all-encompassing fee, as we would a freelancer for this. So if he was actually on staff and we had to pay for that trip and everything else, we probably wouldn't have been able to afford that show. So it was a bit of a confluence of luck in a way that Ollie was moving overseas anyway. He had a partner who was doing a sabbatical in the US, so he planned his life around this thing. And so that was another reason to commission the show, that he was going to the US anyway. So there was some kind of savings around Ollie's lifestyle at the time that meant that we could do the show without having to fully pay for every part of it. So he got compensated for his time in a bundled fee, which is also a way that I would recommend to other people working on shows like this, which is the incentive for it not to go on forever.
Now, Ian, I'd like to turn to marketing. The ABC does a fabulous job of amplifying each of the podcast series it produces. We've discussed before on this podcast the power of cross-promotion within the podcast feed to other podcasts, which is something that obviously ABC can utilise. But for those who don't have that ability, what other marketing activities work best? And perhaps for brands that are listening, what might they benefit from?
I think if you're going to spend money on promoting your podcast, then picking the other podcasts that you love or you think have synergy with the thing that you're doing is probably the best and most efficient place. We know that people who listen to one podcast are looking for recommendations for another, and they do check out ones that are recommended by a podcast that they enjoy already. Again, it's about kind of quality control and making sure you align your quality of whatever you're doing with someone else's show that's of equal value. Anecdotally, it's usually on about the third time that somebody hears about your show that they might go and look it up and download it and press play. So it's an awareness building thing. You can't think of it as wherever you put your bit.ly link, people are going to press on it. They just don't. They'll hear about it from a friend first. They might read about it online second. And then the third time they hear about it is when they're actually going to play it for you. So it's tricky, it's difficult. It takes perseverance, but you need to have all those different platforms covered to make sure that people, hear about you 3 times.
Well, final question, Ian. Can you tell us what the next big Unravel release is going to be? Can we get the scoop here on any upcoming projects?
I can't quite divulge what the next Unravel is going to be. It hasn't quite been commissioned yet, so it's not a reality, but it is going to be an interesting story about a wrongful conviction, and we're hoping that we can roll into production in the new year, and we'll have something in the feed by mid next year for season 6. So that's exciting. But what has actually happened in the meantime is that I've managed to convince my higher-ups to back in a second sort of genre feed, not dissimilar to Unravel, but for history. So a history investigation feed. We're going to kick it off in November. We're hoping to do 2 seasons a year, as we will try to do with Unravel. So we'll pretty much have 4 big documentary shows to run per year, ongoing, hopefully, if we can sustain that. And so the November show it's picking off a really big, iconic Aussie story. It's a mad scam involving horse racing, and that's probably as much as I can say at the moment. And we're going to launch it on Melbourne Cup Day.
Oh,
so we're going to
brilliant.
Go all out for the people who say up to the Cup.
We probably can't turn up to the Melbourne Cup with COVID, so I very much look forward to the podcast. It sounds really exciting.
Yeah.
Good.
Thanks so much, Ian, for joining us on Podcasting Essentials, and all the very best with your renovations and your new podcast studio.
Thanks, Nick. And Nick, yeah, if I ever get the guts up to leave this job, maybe I'll hit you up for a review of my very own podcast from my backyard.
Well, hopefully the next time we meet, we'll be able to see the new studio.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
Ian is so right about fact being stranger than fiction. Some of the stories he and his team manage to tell, really do manage to just leave the listener slack-jawed.
Yeah, I'd never thought of it that way, but it actually makes sense. I love a true story that is almost impossible to believe is actually true.
That's right. And for brands too, it's important to remember that narrative podcasts aren't just the domain of big podcast networks and broadcasters. Ian's production matrix really is a fantastic guide. And if you're able to have those in place, there are ways to scale costs and deliver the rich listening experience that narrative podcasts offer.
Absolutely. And if you don't already, I suggest you go listen to some ABC podcasts, observe how they produce and promote their podcasts. Apart from enjoying some fabulous stories, there is a heap to learn and take away.
Could not agree more, Nick.
Well, that's it for this episode of Podcasting Essentials. Thanks, Nicole, for joining me. I really enjoyed this one.
Me too. It's been remarkable. Thank you, Nick.
For more about us and how we can help you produce a podcast, visit soundcartel.com.au or our socials at soundcartelAU. From the team at Sound Cartel, thanks so much for listening.
Sound